Welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the Director of the Institute for Social Capital, and I'm also the current President of the International Social Capital Association. I'm delighted to present this work that's been many years in the making. We've spent a lot of time thinking and reading and trying to work through the various theories of social capital. And I'd really like to acknowledge all of many people who have contributed ideas to this project, and in particular, Emeritus Professor Lyndon Robertson, who's been extremely influential and extremely valuable in discussing these and putting this together. So Lyndon's here on this call. Welcome, Lyndon, and thanks very much for joining us. So for the past 20 years, I've been obsessed with social capital theories, I don't mind saying, and I've been determined to not only make sense of the complexity, but also to aid others in comprehending and applying the concept. I've extensively explored the literature, I've read thousands of articles, and I've had countless conversations with scholars and practitioners from diverse backgrounds who each have offered their unique insights into the subject. And throughout, I've tried to remain open to the various interpretations and appreciate the merits of every approach to the concept and look beyond the way that I think about it to try and understand others' perspectives as well. However, I think we need to acknowledge that the variety of interpretations in the literature has caused problems for the theories of social capital, making it difficult to draw comparisons between different research, and it can be challenging to have conversations about social capital when we're talking about different things. It can be difficult to make sense of the theory, it's challenging to design quality research, and it's also difficult to apply the concept meaningfully to practical applications. So this not only hampers the accumulation of knowledge, but also undermines the concept's potential to have a transformative impact. So in recent years, I've asked many challenging questions about social capital theories. I've delved deeply into the diverse landscape and looked at approaches that are very unfamiliar to my own. For example, I'm not an economist, but I've extensively explored the economic perspective as well as all of the other perspectives that exist in the literature. And my aim throughout this has been to try to determine the underlying logic of these approaches, the assumptions that might exist, and the overarching commonalities that might unite these different perspectives on social capital. And overall, I've found we're talking about much the same thing, although it's often framed very differently and using different terminology to describe much the same thing. So this paradigm of social capital that I'd like to outline today it's not intended to favor any particular theories of social capital. Rather, it has several aims. The first is to promote theory construction and causal exploration and model clarity, as well as to facilitate the grounding of theory in robust theoretical frameworks. It's really a call to elevate the quality of research and the application of social capital to real-world contexts. And I don't have all the answers. My voice is just one of many. Others will have an important role to play in bringing the concept of social capital to an established paradigm. So I present these ideas as an invitation to an open dialogue, and I extend the opportunity to all who are interested to contribute to the evolution of this concept. And I think this is a conversation we need to have going forward. We need to continue to work on and evolve and reiterate this paradigm that I'm outlining today. So in terms of an overview of this session, I'll start by providing some background and talking about why we would define a social capital paradigm. That includes discussion of what the current problem is and how the problem developed. And I'll also address the question of why we wouldn't just simply define social capital, come up with one definition that everyone would agree with. And I'll identify the disadvantages of not doing so and the reasons why I don't think that's possible at this time. Then we'll have a look at what the actual social capital paradigm looks like and how defining a paradigm might help overall. I'll describe the process that I use to determine what this social capital paradigm pillars may be. And of course, I'll propose some pillars as a starting point that we might be able to use to take forward. So that's the overview of this session. It's quite a long presentation. It's probably in the vicinity of an hour, but there's a lot to cover, and I'll try and work through it steadily, and then we'll have questions and discussion afterwards. So firstly, why would we define a social capital paradigm? Why are we doing this at all? And I think, as everybody knows, social capital has many different meanings. Just about every author starts their publication with some sort of a discussion about this. There's many meanings, often lamenting how complex it is, and there's a tendency to put forward many definitions of social capital, but not necessarily explicitly adopt one of those definitions. And some publications don't even define social capital at all. And even more troubling, there does tend to be a disconnection in some publications between the definition that's provided and then the way in which the concept is actually used in the research, which has obvious problems. And as Robertson and co-authors pointed out back in 2002, many definitions are not actually definitions at all. They define where it exists or what it does, but not necessarily what it is. And this is obviously a problem as well. And the result has been, unfortunately, confusion and inconsistency, and this has been quite well documented in the literature by people who are critical of social capital. In a previous webinar, I described all of this as the wicked problems of social capital theory, these difficult and challenging problems that we need to overcome. But by now, I think that all of these problems can be resolved if we embrace this idea of a social capital paradigm and the pillars that I'll lay out in this session. But regardless, until now, it's been very difficult to make comparisons between studies or to extend or support existing findings. And it's confusing about how one description or finding may relate to another when the meaning of social capital is so different between different studies. And scholars tend to talk past each other due to this lack of consistent meaning. I find when I'm talking about social capital, I need to preface anything that I say with something like, depending on what the meaning of social capital, or if social capital is understood as X, then we can start having a conversation. But this is cumbersome, and it's difficult then to have these conversations if you need to actually spend some time first to identify what you mean by social capital before you can start having any kind of conversation about it. And all this really, for us researchers, means that it's difficult to evaluate what good science looks like, or you could say what good scholarship looks like, if you like. And the reason is because there's a lack of accepted standards, theories, models, assumptions, all of these things that would normally exist in a paradigm. And this reduces the ability to build scientific knowledge. And ultimately, and I think most troubling, is that it undermines the explanatory and transformative potential of the concept. And having talked with thousands of different scholars over the years, unfortunately, I think this is something that many people feel, that social capital doesn't quite deliver on the promise of what it could do. People can be a bit frustrated and perhaps underwhelmed by the explanatory and transformative potential of the concept, which is a shame because I think it has enormous potential. So therefore, why did this become a problem? Well, I think this has also been well documented in the literature. People come to social capital from so many different perspectives, levels of interests, different applications, different methodological requirements, and so forth. And the result often is that we use different terminology for very similar ideas. Lyndon and I regularly have conversations where we'll use different terminology, but once we actually share our ideas and what we mean by it, we actually realize we're talking about much the same thing. And this different terminology can really get in the way of that. And unfortunately, there's a bit of a black box that tends to obscure the processes involved in social capital formation and activation. And in many ways, perhaps this has been something that's allowed the concept of social capital to become popular precisely because of the lack of theoretical foundations. But if we want to take this forward and we want to improve the usefulness of the concept, then we need to start defining a paradigm, and that may help to resolve some of these problems. So there is this question of, well, why don't we develop a unifying definition of social capital instead of defining a paradigm? Like, surely that should be the task, to define social capital and get everyone to agree on it. And that may be possible. We may be able to do that. But I think, unfortunately, it would be so broad that it would be not particularly useful, especially for empirical inquiry. It would become just about everything. And ultimately, it may be impossible to reach universal agreement due to the differences that I outlined in the previous slide. And if we were able to do this, it may actually be undesirable at this time as well, if it were to limit the scope of inquiry and application. If it's specific enough to be useful, it may also be limiting at the same time. So therefore, I think a unifying definition is not possible and probably not even desirable at this particular time. However, I think it is possible to develop a series of statements that all, or perhaps almost all, scholars would agree on. And that's what I'm looking to do in this presentation, is to develop these statements that we could call the pillars of social capital, broadly true, generally applicable statements that most people would agree on. So what is a paradigm? If I'm trying to define this paradigm and start to put some pillars to it, a paradigm is a dominant and widely accepted framework or model that guides the research theories and practices within a particular scientific field or discipline. And it encompasses the fundamental concepts, theories, methods, and assumptions that shape how scholars approach and understand a particular study area. And I think, as we've seen, a lack of a paradigm has led to the current problem, particularly understanding what good scholarship looks like in social capital research. It has meant that the onus of undertaking good science falls on scholars and to peer reviewers who do not have an established framework for evaluation. And while many scholars have produced excellent research, there are others who have not. And the literature is plentiful with examples of poor scholarship, or what Ben Fine has described as hackademia or hack academia, and that type of poor scholarship that unfortunately is quite commonplace in the social capital literature. So if we think about what this social capital paradigm may be, what does this actually look like? First, I think it's true to say that the social capital theory is still in the pre-paradigm phase of the Kuhnian cycle. And this is not a problem, except that it's persisted now for, 40 years. And there doesn't seem to be any sign that we're starting to reach agreement around frameworks and theories and models that we may be able to take forward to improve the quality of research. I think it's important that we do. I think at this time, explicitly and narrowly defining the concepts would not be possible and probably desirable. I think that's a really important point to bring up, that we need to continue to keep it quite broad at this time. Otherwise, we may exclude or alienate particular scholars who find their work falling outside of the paradigm. And if that were to occur, then we would end up in much the same situation we're in now, where we have these competing and different meanings that perhaps are almost contradictory, and we wouldn't be making any particular progress. So we need to balance keeping it broad with starting to narrow it, include everybody, but still be critical in some way. I think it's challenging, but I think it's also important for us to do. What I think we can do is find these similarities in reasoning processes that exist in the different theories and start to work towards these broad statements that we might be able to agree upon. So this presentation does not aim to outline a very specific blueprint for social capital research. I'm not going to define social capital. I'm not going to tell scholars how to conduct research. All we're really trying to do here is to put some tentative steps towards reaching consensus that might guide the foundation of and the development of some agreed standards and theories and models and assumptions. It's like proposing a fence around the paradigm where we can start to rein it in and perhaps eliminate some of the chaos that exists in the literature. So as such, the pillars of the social capital paradigm don't intend to preference any particular theory, or in fact exclude any reasonable theories, not intended to limit explanations, and not an attempt to create an operational definition. But I think this is what we can do: encourage theory building, exploration of causality, clarity of models, connections to theoretical foundations, and examination of assumptions. And the reasons why I think a paradigm would help is that it will allow us to broadly clarify what social capital is and what it does, which is one of the challenges we have in the literature, is separating what it is from what it does. Help to avoid truisms, tautologies, inconsistencies, incongruences that are unfortunately quite commonplace in the literature. and allow scholars to create definitions that they can operationalize, that are logically consistent and that are very clear and explicit about what it is relative to what it does. And through that process, we may be able to start coming in from the thousands of different definitions that exist in the literature. We may be able to narrow it to perhaps, application-specific or discipline-specific definitions. Perhaps we will have 10 definitions rather than 1,000, which would be a big improvement. And eventually we may end up with one, but that's a long way down the road, I think. It may help practitioners and scholars to see how different perspectives relate to each other in complementary rather than conflicting ways, and open possibilities for comparisons between studies, and ultimately move from the pre-paradigm phase to the mature phase of science, and ultimately improve the explanatory and transformative potential of the concept. I think this is extremely ambitious, but I also think it's essential that we try. And the International Social Capital Association is the perfect forum for us to be able to have these conversations and get involvement from a wide range of different scholars to contribute towards this, and collectively we may be able to achieve it. So my process mostly involved asking difficult questions about social capital that others don't tend to ask, and perhaps most people don't particularly want to think about. But I did have a process to go about this to try and find the consistency and agreement that exists in the extremely diverse literature. And the first place that I started was by examining the logic and theory of social and capital. And I started with what social capital is. And this sounds too simple, really, but other scholars have taken a similar approach, and it's interesting and revealing that what they have written about the meaning of social and capital. Social was not particularly fruitful. It's obvious that social relates to relationships and interaction and exchange between people. It's broad and it's general, and it includes a lot of different things, but it's pretty clear what we mean by social. But capital, though, was more interesting, and a great many scholars have written about the meaning of capital in social capital. Some authors have suggested it is a metaphor, but what does that mean? And for many authors, it means that social capital is capital-like. That is, that it possesses many of the qualities of capital without having to qualify with all of the classical meanings of capital. For example, being private, divisible, alienable, and so forth. However, others have suggested that it is a metaphor because social capital is just valuable, as in that it's not particularly capital-like, it's just something that is valuable. But I question this because surely it is valuable because of what it does, as in it improves individual or collective well-being. So it still does something. It's still capital or capital-like, but the means to get there is further removed and obscured. And still other authors have suggested that social capital is a form of capital, that is, that it's not metaphorical, although they acknowledge that it does require some modification to the classical understanding of capital. And if we see the classical theories of capital have undergone expansion and modification over time. And this change reflects an understanding that production is not just the result of physical capital, but also natural capital and human capital, and acknowledge more recently social capital, or what Bourdieu described as capital in all its forms. And so over time, we've seen that physical capital and financial capital used in the production of goods and services has also been expanded to understand the role of natural capital. A factory, if it doesn't have inputs of natural capital, can't do a whole lot, as well as human capital, and that labor is important and an investment in people can produce returns. And a little bit more recently, but still 40 or 50 years ago, social capital and the general idea that people can do more with others, and perhaps other forms of capital as well. But to do this, to be able to expand the classical theories of capital, it has required moving past some of those classical characteristics, such as being private and divisible, alienable, transferable, and so forth. But what remains, in the opinion of many scholars, is the core meaning of capital, stripped of its neoclassical framing. And for most people, I think that the fundamental characteristic is that capital is a potential to do or to provide something. It is a potential, an ability, a capacity to produce a flow. And that flow can be readily understood when we look at other forms of capital. For example, physical capital of a factory, for example, produces a flow of products such as shoes. A truck, also physical capital, produces a flow of transportation services, or a printer produces a flow of printed documents. And we can understand, say, the human capital of a surgeon, that ability to produce the flow of successful surgeries, or the human capital of a musician that can produce a flow of musical performances and recordings. So capital can yield productive services in future or be used to obtain future benefit. And it highlights the potential nature of capital. Emery Castle stated that capital in any form qualifies as capital only if it makes humans more productive when they use it in combination with other forms of capital. And generally speaking, mainstream economists define capital assets as those that have potential to produce goods and services. So it is clear that it is a potential, but in the literature, although this is widely supported, it's very rare to find specific reference to potential. But it is implied. For example, Coleman identified that social capital facilitates the actions of individuals. Putnam talked about it facilitating cooperation. Adler and Kwong equated it with goodwill available to individuals for future benefit, of course, that potential nature. Fukuyama stated that it permits cooperation, and Portes and Sensenbrenner identified it as expectations for action. All of these are consistent with social capital being a potential to do something, which is that key quality of capital. And other authors have been even more explicit about this, stating that social capital accumulates as a stock that produces a stream of benefits. And Coleman also talked about this potential nature as well in more detail. Al Schmidt called for an understanding that social capital is not its consequences. It is not what it does. And he also said it's important to distinguish the capital goods or factory from its products or consequences, from the means of building factories. Therefore, social capital is a potential to do something, and it's not what it does. And we can readily see this quality in other forms of capital. For example, human capital. All of these definitions reflect the potential nature of capital, the innate acquired skills which are a potential to be able to do something. Gary Becker defined human capital as knowledge, information, ideas, skills, and the health of individuals. And the OECD, much the same, and actually defined what it does, that facilitates the creation of personal, social, and economic well-being. So all of these reflect the potential nature of social capital. So we could put this then into a basic schema of capital. This is the logic, that an investment or a byproduct of other activities that creates a source, creates the potential, I should say, that can then provide future benefits and returns. The general idea with social capital is that in the literature, there are many different perspectives about what that potential is of social capital, perhaps reflecting the multiple complex reasons for human action. And this is just a small selection from the literature of these different ideas about what the potential is. And any one author may focus on one or more aspect of that potential. For example, Putnam considered it social organization and gave 3 specific examples that we can see in the list: networks, norms, and trust. But presumably this is a non-exhaustive list of examples, and he would consider social capital to be any feature of social organization, however that is defined. Bonding and bridging, while they don't appear in the list as such, they're conceptualized as the result of one or more of the following. It could be homophily or similarity, or propinquity or closeness, or belonging, whether a group is inward-looking or outward-looking, and we can see these in the list. Some of these represent a potential directly, while others involved assumed processes that influence the potential for action. For example, homophily is the tendency of individuals to associate with similar others, and it is based on a variety of social and psychological processes that often result in a potential for certain types of social action. So what we can conclude from all of this is the first pillar, that social capital is a potential. It is not what it does. But this does not say what that potential is. So it does not say what social capital is, but it does indicate the properties of social capital as a potential. And most meanings of social capital are broadly consistent with this statement. However, as discussed in the literature, it's quite common for authors to confuse social capital with what it is with what it does. And it's possible that some scholars may not fall under this pillar due to the use of the word resources to describe social capital. Resources is typically poorly defined or even not defined in the literature, and it can be quite confusing what it actually means. For some authors, like Nan Lin, it's clearly defined. Social resources is clearly defined. However, for many following scholars that have extended and adapted the meaning, it's led to social capital being perhaps the outcomes of the potential rather than the potential. And I would question that approach because a focus on the outcomes is problematic because it further removes the analysis from the processes that create the desired outcomes, which makes it more difficult to understand and develop explanations and more difficult to design meaningful interventions. So I think adopting this pillar would greatly improve social capital in research and practice because it allows us to focus specifically on what social capital is relative to what it does. So moving on to the next stage of my process, I wanted to try to identify the common themes, the superordinates and the assumptions that are involved in all these different theories of social capital. See if we can find some consistency there. And what I find is that many authors give lists of components, but on closer examination, these lists are more examples rather than exhaustive lists. And so I thought long and hard and read widely and talked to many people to try to uncover the possible superordinates of these lists. And if we're to define a paradigm, we must find these consistencies. And I thought and hoped, and I believe they do, lie in these superordinates of the various lists of components and dimensions and so forth. So I took the following approach. I started with the claimed outcomes of social capital to see if we could find a superordinate of the outcomes. I then looked at the claimed, implied, and assumed logic of various theories, and for each definition, component, dimension, and so forth, see how it's consistent with the logic schema to try to identify what the superordinate is of all of these, complex lists and dimensions and aspects and so forth of social capital. So I started with outcomes. What does social capital do? And when I first started working on this, I was not clear exactly what the outcomes were. And when I did literature searches, it did not immediately reveal the answer to the question. But there are common references to cooperation, collective action, information sharing, social introductions, social support, favorable terms of exchange, actions based on trust, reciprocity, and various other giving, helping, and caring actions. And I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but these are the main ones that tend to come up in the literature. Now, Putnam described the outcomes of social capital as facilitating coordination and cooperation, which covers a wide range of human actions. The word cooperation has at least two dictionary meanings, one being the action or process of working together to the same end, but also assistance, especially in complying readily with requests. So when taken together, these outcomes could potentially encompass all social action. We could then question whether the superordinate, perhaps, of all of these is social actions. And what I mean by social actions is those actions that are oriented towards others. That's a broad and probably quite complex idea. How is that different from other types of actions? And I gave an entire webinar on that recently, exploring the outcomes of social capital. But it's important to acknowledge that it facilitates, enables, or encourages social actions, that other social actions, as in actions oriented towards others, can occur for other reasons. For example, if someone holds a gun to your head and tells you to do something to somebody else, you may do it, but it's not going to be because of social capital. I don't think anyone would suggest that it is. So the social capital facilitates, enables, encourages, rather than being a direct causal relationship or the only thing that causes social actions. And it's also important to acknowledge that intrinsic outcomes can be associated with that potential for social action, such as psychological well-being. And this is something that is acknowledged in the literature on other capitals, these non-use or intrinsic outcomes. And we could look at the literature on natural capital as a good example of these kinds of non-use or intrinsic outcomes. So I gave a webinar on the outcomes of social capital, and I identified at least 4 perhaps modes of action that may be relevant to social capital. I think it remains to be seen whether all of these actions oriented towards others should be considered the outcomes of social capital. But regardless, I think it's clear that the second pillar could be that the outcomes of social capital are social actions. Now, this is too broad to be particularly useful, but it should focus on what social capital does and allow future scholars to refine this further. And this is, broadly speaking, the second part of the paradigm. And that is, we now can be clear that, broadly speaking, social capital is about a potential for social action. So we could refine then the logic schema to include the actions of individuals that then contribute towards future benefits. And I think it's important to differentiate between these actions and the future benefits, because when we see the examples of these, we can see that the actions may contribute to these future benefits, but a variety of other factors are also involved. Whether or not innovation occurs is not just the result of people cooperating, but perhaps it's also the result of the availability of financial capital or institutions and so forth that may be able to facilitate that. But regardless, we can see now this is only version 2 of 5. We'll continue to refine this schema as we continue to identify the pillars of the paradigm. Very important clarification, though, before we move on. The potential for social action may sound like a definition, but it is not. It's not a definition of social capital. It doesn't say anything about what the potential is, so it doesn't say anything really about social capital, except to reaffirm that it is a form of capital. The definition of social capital must describe the nature of the potential. And to date, as we've discussed, authors have focused on different aspects of that potential, or different explanations for why the potential exists. So if we had a unifying definition of social capital, we must find a description of that potential that encompasses everyone's perspectives and interests while remaining consistent with the meaning and logic of capital. And that's likely to be too broad to be particularly useful. But if we did have a broad unifying definition, then every inquiry could clearly and explicitly designate the aspect or explanation that will be used for the inquiry while remaining consistent with the paradigm of social capital more broadly. But I think it's essential that we clarify that this is not a definition of social capital, because it doesn't actually say anything about what the potential is. Moving on quite quickly, the next part of my process was to explore the claimed, implied, and assumed logic of social capital theories. And what I did was look at, for every meaning, how does that relate to a potential for social action? And so we can explore the examples in the literature of what the potential is and why these represent a potential for social action. And for any one of them, such as relationships, they're a potential because they involve reputation and goodwill and trust, empathy and norms, and they represent a potential for social action. So it may not necessarily be directly that relationships are a potential, but the embedded qualities of relationships could be understood as a potential for social action. And when we explore what all of these are, we find that when we take into account the underlying assumptions, they could all be understood as the values, attitudes, beliefs, emotions, and understandings that influence the potential for social action and the nature of that action when it does occur. For example, people share information or make a social introduction or cooperate with someone because of their values and attitudes and so forth. People are influenced by norms because of how they understand them. People are influenced by institutions because of how they understand the obligations, expectation, rules, and so forth. And there are many reasons for human action, but they all could be understood as relating to those values, attitudes, beliefs, emotions, and so forth. And they're often expressed as relationships, norms, trust, and identity, and those kinds of things. So this is still a list. I want to try and avoid lists. So perhaps the superordinate of all of these values, attitudes, beliefs, we could describe as mental constructs. Now, there's other terms for this. You could call it habitus. You could call it life world. You could call it background understandings. I don't think it particularly matters. The point is that it exists in people's minds. It doesn't exist in thin air. It exists in those mental constructs of the individuals. And many of those mental constructs, whether they be values, attitudes, beliefs, or emotions, they're shared with others. So to say that social capital resides in relationships or is the property of relationships or are shared understandings such as norms does not mean it exists in thin air. Clearly and obviously, it exists in the mental constructs of individuals, and in their mental constructs. And this surely shouldn't be a contentious claim, but numerous scholars have made statements that seem to contradict this pillar by claiming that social capital exists in relationships, not in individuals. The intersubjective aspects of social capital, things like the shared understandings like norms, may appear to exist independent of individuals, but really this is like suggesting walking on a sandy beach does not involve walking on the sand. So this is a pillar I don't think is too contentious. The next part of my process was to explore the universal applicability of common claims about social capital. And I've examined these 6 that I think are worthy of exploring in a little more detail to see whether these could start providing the foundation for the pillars of the paradigm. So I'll work through each one of these individually. The first one is social capital being multidimensional. And over time, different authors have proposed different dimensions. The World Bank had 6 dimensions, and more recently, the structural, relational, and cognitive set of dimensions has become incredibly popular in the literature. But there is a question. If all aspects of social capital are mental constructs, then is social capital actually multidimensional? Because it sounds like that's just one dimension. But I explored this further. And I found that all of the aspects of social capital in some way relate to or influence or predispose people to act in certain ways. So for any one of these, we can understand it being a predisposition. That norms, for example, when I walk into a library, because of norms, I'm predisposed to act in certain ways. Or belonging, if I have a teammate who needs help, I'm predisposed to help them because of a sense of belonging. Or solidarity, when I have solidarity with people, I'm predisposed to act in certain ways because of that solidarity. And we could do this process for virtually any aspect of social capital, at least when we understand the underlying assumptions and how it relates to a potential for social action. So all of these we can see influence the nature of human action, and they all predispose certain actions. And this reflects the potential nature of social capital. So it is consistent. However, not all aspects of the potential for social action resolve to predispositions. If you think about what relationships do, for example, they shape the nature of social action, but they also facilitate or enable that action to occur. So imagine living in a community full of extremely generous, caring, and trustworthy people, but you don't know anyone. The potential for positive social action exists and is strong, but there are few opportunities for this action to occur. If you needed help with something, you could walk out on the street and randomly ask people for help. However, this is inefficient and likely ineffective because you don't know who has the requisite skills, abilities, and predispositions to help you. So therefore, we can see that if people are not connected, then they cannot call upon others, and there can only be unplanned and incidental outcomes, regardless of people's predispositions for action. So I'll use another example to illustrate this point further. Hypothetically, a guy called Mike lives on my street. He's an elderly man who lives alone and cannot do simple tasks around the home. He is a retired accountant with a lifetime of experience. I'd love to help him with odd jobs around his house, and I'm sure he would love to give me advice about my business accounting, but we don't know each other. I may bump into him on the street, but I don't know what he knows. He doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know I'm willing to help him. And so there can only be this unplanned or incidental outcomes. So this other idea or dimension we could describe, broadly speaking, as opportunity. But what I found is that opportunities and predispositions don't seem to share a superordinate. They seem to be distinct processes. I couldn't find any way to link them. You could have predispositions and opportunity. You could have opportunity without predispositions. They seem to be completely unique. So if we explore what these two are, then in a little more detail, opportunities stem from connectedness, but also from knowing. If you don't know others, know about them, know what they do, can do, who they know, then the potential of social capital is limited. And the predispositions for action include all forms of reason and motivation and relate to whether or not social action occurs when opportunities arise and the nature of this action as well. This distinction is similar but not equivalent to the popular structural and cognitive dimensions that exist in the social capital literature. The commonly cited components of the structural dimension influence both opportunities and predispositions. For example, roles structure opportunities, but they also shape the nature of people's predispositions for action that is related to those roles. And the cognitive dimension, broadly speaking, relates to the nature of predispositions, norms, trust, shared understandings, those kinds of things. So the inclusion of opportunities and predispositions may be the basis for Alejandro Portes's observation that theories of social capital often have different and even contradictory processes. And clearly the processes that represent opportunities are distinctly different that relate to the predispositions or the influence of the nature of action. And as distinct processes, some may contradict, although others may reinforce. But the most important point is that combining these processes in a single concept is only problematic if the concept is not considered multidimensional. And therefore, multidimensionality is the fourth pillar of the paradigm. I don't think we actually need to define what the dimensions are. The predispositions and opportunities that I've discussed today does not exist in the literature, although it may align, roughly speaking, with structural and cognitive dimensions. But it doesn't matter. Multidimensionality allows us to incorporate the multiple modes of human action. And even if we group all of the reasons for human action together as one dimension, there still is that question about how opportunity relates to the potential of capital. And I don't think this is contentious. Just about everybody agrees that it's multidimensional, but digging into the logic of it, as I have done here, may assist scholars to design better research and for practitioners to design better interventions. So the next claim is that social capital is context specific. And I've modified this a little bit, and I've said that, well, the activation of social capital is contextual, because what most scholars mean by context is often confused with the nature of social capital itself, and they don't often mean the activation context. If you were to consider social capital to be the existence of relationships, then of course the content and nature of those relationships is important. And some scholars would call that context. But to me, that is the essential part of the potential that is social capital. And that's not what I mean by context here. What I mean is that some outcomes of social capital, or in fact many, can only occur in the presence of other forms of capital. And I've given some examples. If a tractor cannot be loaned, if no one in the community possesses one, information can only be shared if someone knows it. And this is a common characteristic of capital. A truck, for example, being physical capital, can provide transportation services, but to be activated, it must have fuel. a driver, roads to drive on, goods to transport, and so forth. A truck has the potential to provide transportation services, and it is physical capital, but if you drop it in a swamp, the context would prevent its activation. And we can also see an example of human capital, such as that of a surgeon, that is the potential to perform surgical procedures. But in the absence of an operating theatre, surgical equipment, support staff, and so forth, the potential of the surgeon's human capital cannot be activated, or at least not fully. If they don't even have a rusty knife to make the cuts with, there's not much they can do in terms of activating their surgical human capital. And there perhaps are other aspects of the activation context that are also relevant. So whichever way you see this, I think it's very obvious that the activation of social capital is contextual. Many outcomes of social capital involve mobilizing or activating or enhancing or transforming other forms of capital. And as such, social capital is not a panacea, since it has limited capacity in the absence of other forms of capital. We must understand the context within which social capital is activated, because it cannot replace or make up for a lack of other forms of capital, just like a truck cannot be much use without fuel, a driver, and roads to drive on, and so forth. So we can now update our schema of social capital to include the process, which produces a stock, which produces a flow. And that flow may mobilize, activate, or enhance other forms of capital. I think arguably not all action-based outcomes require other forms of capital. For example, I could provide social support to somebody by giving them a hug. I'm not sure other forms of capital are required for that to occur, but certainly the potential is significantly diminished in the absence of other forms of capital, and that's an important point to make and understand about social capital. So we've addressed the first two common claims. We're now going to move on to social capital being dynamic. And certainly it's clear that the outcomes of social capital influence the stock of social capital. For example, social action influences the nature of future social action. And this is because all action has meaning and creates and recreates norms and perceptions of trustworthiness and so forth. But I think the best way to illustrate this is with an example. Say social capital that has a potential for information sharing. But when that information sharing action occurs, the potential of this and other future actions is modified or changed. For example, it may strengthen or weaken relationships, the action of information sharing, that is. It may create or recreate norms. It may shape perceptions of trustworthiness. It might modify empathy. It may affect reputation and goodwill and so forth. There's many, many different ways in which the action of information sharing can affect social capital itself, the potential for future actions to occur. And in many ways, social capital is even more dynamic than that even within the span of a single interaction, the potential for social action and the nature of that action can change considerably. At the start of an interaction with a stranger, there may be limited potential for social action, but humans are highly capable of understanding others, finding similarities, shared identities, developing obligations and expectations, developing empathy and sympathy and so forth. And this can create a potential for social capital just through the actual span or process of interacting with somebody. And of course, it can occur the other way around. You may start with a disposition to be giving and generous, perhaps, but as a result of the actions of the other individual, you may change and decide not to actually act in that way. So as we can see, whichever way you look at it, social capital is dynamic. This is well acknowledged in the literature. I think digging into what this really means can be useful, both from a research point of view, but also for practical applications, because the dynamic nature represents both risks as well as opportunities that can be either mitigated or, in the case of opportunities, accentuated. So we can then update our schema. We're up to now version 4 of 5. Very easy. We just simply add that dynamic nature between the actions influencing the potential. So moving on to the next one is that social capital can produce positive and negative outcomes. And like other forms of capital, of course, that is possible depending on context and perspective. The nature of outcomes do not necessarily indicate the nature of the capital, because social capital tends to produce different outcomes simultaneously. And we can see what this means for other forms of capital. For example, human capital and knowing how to commit fraud can be used to positive or negative ends. That is, to commit fraud or to prevent fraud. And there are many examples. A chemist could use their human capital to make a bomb. A hammer, which is an example of physical capital, could be used to build a house or could be used as a weapon. But it doesn't change the property of the capital itself. And it can always produce different positive and negative outcomes depending on perspectives. And to illustrate this point, Robertson and co-authors stated that most productive processes involving capital produce both goods and bads. A plant may produce steel, which is a good, and smoke, a bad. Would you say that a plant is not capital because it produces smoke along with that steel? Therefore, I think we can put this as a pillar, can produce both positive and negative outcomes. And this is important because social capital cannot be a potential that is only social capital when it produces certain outcomes and not when it doesn't. That doesn't make any sense, and it's paradoxical, it's nonsense. So it's essential that we acknowledge the multiple complex outcomes of social capital and the potential for it to produce both positive and negative outcomes. So we can update our schema of social capital now. All I've done here is simply add the word including externalities. This is economic terminology. We could find other ways to describe the potential for there to be positive and negative outcomes to occur. So we can use this schema. I think it's very useful. We can use it to understand other forms of capital. So throughout this presentation, I've talked about the human capital of a surgeon. We can understand it in the context of this schema by seeing that education, training, and experience, so forth, is the source that creates the human capital itself, those surgical skills, abilities, so forth, that facilitate the actual surgeries, the cutting, the dissecting, the stitching, that contribute towards successful surgeries and improve well-being of patients. And I didn't put it here, but also maybe complications and even the death of patients being the possible negative outcomes that can occur. And the activation context, the specialized equipment, support staff, and so forth that's required really for these outcomes to occur, for the capital to be activated. And the example of the truck that I've also been talking about, manufacturing, which creates the truck, which facilitates the transportation of goods, that contributes towards economic prosperity, but also perhaps air pollution, maybe roadkill, variety of other negative outcomes that may also occur, and the activation context being the fuel, the driver, the roads, and so forth that make it possible. So this schema, I think, is a useful tool to understand not only social capital, but other forms of capital as well, and develop and understand that consistent logic. So we'll move on. There's two more for us to have a look at. The first one is that social capital has individual and collective properties. And if we look at the literature, we can see consistent reference to both individual and collective properties, things like human agency and social structures, and the relationship between subjectivity and intersubjectivity. And certainly the potentiality of social capital stems from the individual in the context of others and relates to an understanding, an individual's understanding, but also understanding what other people understand as well, such as social norms are what people think other people think. So it does involve individual agency in the context of others and the relationship between an individual's mental constructs and the intersection with different people's different cognitive perspectives. So let's try and unpack this a little bit more and look at what the individual properties are relative to the collective properties. So an individual has tangible control over some aspects of their social capital, since they can build and maintain their own relationships. They can develop a reputation for being trustworthy, for example. They can develop goodwill. They can achieve positions within social groupings. These are all things that influence the nature of social action towards them, that an individual has some level of control over and an individual can benefit from. But there's also collective properties as well, because the potential for social action is influenced by a range of factors that are beyond the control of the individual and therefore not the property of the individual. So these are things like norms, trust, identity, the nature of rules and their enforcement, and various other beliefs about how others will or should act in a given context. These are beyond the control of the individual. These are more the property of the collective. So although the beliefs are held in the mental constructs of individuals, they're really the properties of the collective that exert an influence on human action. I've rushed through that extremely quickly, but I think it's very clear, and I think most people in the literature would also agree with this, that there are individual and collective properties. For research, I'm not sure exactly what this means. It complicates things quite a bit, but for practice, it represents two avenues for building and improving social capital. An intervention can focus on the individual properties and encouraging people to change those qualities of the individual, but also they can work on the properties of the collective as well. So it's two ways to change and improve social capital. The final claim is that about universality. And certainly social capital is not universally available to everyone in a social grouping, because every individual is unique and has different opportunities and abilities to create and utilize social capital based on a variety of earned and inherited commonalities, various preconceptions and stereotypes that others may have of them, as well as differential levels of ownership and access to other forms of capital. And unfortunately, many theories of social capital frequently universalize across these categories, but it does not have to be so. If we connect to the sort of theoretical framework that I've been discussing in this webinar and ground our understanding in what social capital is, it's possible to engage with the differential access to social capital that exists based on those predispositions and opportunities that different individuals have. I think this is a pillar that we could adopt. I think most people would probably agree with this, although the theories themselves do tend to universalize, as I've discussed in the literature. I did want to include one more thing, and that is that social capital is not one thing that does one thing. And I'm less confident about this because it's different than how social capital is typically understood. But the potential for one type of social action does not necessarily mean there is also a potential for other types of social action. And what I mean is that social capital can be different things since it can produce different outcomes. For example, there may be a potential for people to share information, but those same people may be disinclined to make social introductions or to exchange goods without contracts or to provide social support, etc. So social capital is different to social capital that involves a potential for other outcomes, such as social introductions. You know, it's possible for a group of people to be cooperative and distrusting at the same time. For example, they may work together to improve a school, but not trust each other enough to loan personal belongings. Different social capital, that is, different predispositions and opportunities, can produce a range of different outcomes. And treating social capital as one thing may confound research, because it's a bit like treating acids as one thing and then researching whether acids dissolve rocks. Well, you'd get mixed results because some acids do and some acids don't, but there'd be no mechanism for understanding why. And it's important if we understand the different outcomes of social capital can produce, and therefore the different forms of social capital. And this is true of all forms of capital. You know, physical capital produces a range of different services. While all physical capital has certain characteristics, there is a difference between examples of physical capital, such as a factory, a laptop, a hammer, and so forth. Same with human capital. It has common characteristics, but the outcomes an engineer can produce are very different than the outcomes that a musician, a teacher, or a doctor can produce. I mean, imagine treating other forms of capital as one thing. You know, for example, the human capital of surgeons. Would you hire someone for a surgical position if they had any 10 years of experience in education? No, of course not. You'd be looking for someone with 10 years of surgical experience in education. And examples from physical capital are quite frankly absurd. Would you say to someone, bring me 3 kilograms of physical capital so I can look at this microscopic thing? Of course not. You'd say, can you bring me a microscope? Because you understand that different forms of physical capital can provide different services and do different things. So I think that this is something I'd like to propose. I think it requires further consideration, but it seems to be important. And this may help with improving the replicability of studies and the comparisons between studies, because without this consideration, scholars may be confused about why social capital does or does not produce certain outcomes. And this, of course, would undermine the explanatory potential of the concept. And for practical application, it helps to improve our understanding of what produces the desired outcome and improve outcomes as well, how to improve outcomes. So they're the 10 pillars. Quite a few of them there. I'd really like to get your input on whether you think you would agree or disagree with these. So I've got a poll within Zoom, and I'd like you to indicate your general agreement or disagreement with each of these pillars. So from strongly agree to somewhat agree, perhaps you're unsure, unconvinced, you need to think about it some more, or you need more information, or perhaps you somewhat disagree with the pillar, or perhaps even you strongly disagree with it. Any view is valid. We'd really like to hear what you think, and of course any sort of ideas may help us to be able to refine and improve these pillars, keeping in mind, of course, that we want to produce an inclusive paradigm that everyone can get behind and agree. Ultimately, we've put forward 10 pillars. Some of these may drop away as not being representative of the paradigm, or we may in fact identify other pillars that we haven't included here that are relevant for inclusion. So please give us your honest assessment of each of these in the poll in Zoom. While you're doing that, I'll move on and talk about challenges, limitations, and implications. So, of course, from here, how can we progress and develop an inclusive paradigm? One of the biggest challenges we think is how we can communicate these ideas in ways that everyone will understand and everyone will agree with. The framing and the terminology is vastly different between different disciplines, and it can be a real challenge to find language that everyone can agree with and get behind and make sense to them. As I described earlier, Lyndon and I will have conversations where we use vastly different language, different terms to describe what we ultimately find is much the same thing. And even the framing, like we might frame the whole idea differently, but we realize that there's a lot of similarity between it as well. So then this is the first sort of proposal of what the pillars may be. How can we refine these pillars and reach widespread agreement from interested parties? We want people to engage with this. It's not easy. You've got to think deeply. You've got to communicate a lot and share ideas. You might think you've got an idea, but then once you actually talk about it, you realize that perhaps you haven't thought it through all the way. So we need to find some ways to have a lot of discourse about this so that we can reiterate these pillars as theory develops and it evolves. I have no expectation that this is it. We're going to put them in stone. This is something that should reiterate and develop over time. And I think there's also a consideration about any approaches that may fall outside of the paradigm, because I think in general that's undesirable. If people can't get behind this paradigm, then we'll continue to have competing and perhaps conflicting understandings and approaches to social capital, which simply perpetuates the very problem that we're trying to avoid. And in fact, there may be some scholarly fields that have methodological requirements that conflict with this paradigm. And we also don't want to have that as well. So I think it's a little bit challenging, and we need to find ways to be able to balance this. But clearly the next step is to seek widespread input and discourse on the pillars and the nature of the social capital paradigm. And I think the International Social Capital Association is the perfect forum for that. There's a discussion group forum that the association has where people can put forward ideas, and perhaps we can also hold future events as well. And Lyndon and I are very interested to talk with anybody who would like to dig into this and explore it further as well. Inevitably, of course, we need to produce some publications so that it can enter the body of knowledge and people can start to make use of this and cite it and use it in their work. So hopefully you've had enough time on the poll. I might just give you one more minute to get your answers in. This is a small selection of the references that I made a reference to in this presentation. There's many others as well, of course, perhaps thousands of different publications that I've read over the years. So we'll just give you one more minute to work on the poll, and then we'll get to questions and discussion. So if you have finished the poll and you want to start thinking about questions you might like to ask or points you'd like to bring up, you can post in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you would like to get started on the discussion. So have I missed anything in the chat? Any questions or points we need to address? Anybody, or is everybody just desperate to see the results of the poll? I want to give you another minute. There's 10 different questions there for you to answer, so I want to give you a couple more minutes just to make sure you can respond to each of those, put a bit of thought in. Could I go back to the pillars so you can see perhaps there's one of those particular pillars you'd like to bring up and raise some questions or discussion about? Beverly, yes, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Of course, I'm going to start from the position. I'm going to talk about research design. You know, a lot of the things that you addressed in the beginning of this presentation, I think can be worked out through credible research design. Not everything that everyone does under the heading of research is actually research. And whatever happens from this point going forward, we need to make sure that we're doing really good research. Also, because, you know, garbage in, garbage out, bias, none of that stuff really helps us when we talk about getting toward a good paradigm for social capital. But also, pillar number 10, social capital is not one thing that does one thing. I can personally attest to that. If you remember, gosh, it's been a couple of years ago, I talked about my practical application of social capital when I worked in the Pentagon. And it wasn't about, you know, one definition or one dimension of social capital. What it was about was where I was in the particular network at the time. If I looked at the Pentagon as the overall network, sometimes, depending on the issue, I might have been bonding, I might have been bridging, or I might have been standing in a structural hole where here I am between two people that need each other, but they don't know that because they don't know each other, so that I can step in and bring these two people together. Or it may be a relational aspect of social capital because I exist in a structure in a certain way where I speak the same language as someone, and we have this relationship under the Nehapier-Goschel dimensions of social capital where we can grow capital and solve issues. So I thought it was very fascinating that you came up that social capital is not one thing that does one thing. It just depended for me in my practical experience where I sat in a network and what was needed. So I'm an advocate of that.
Yeah, thanks, Beverly. I think that because social capital is so complex and it's somewhat intangible in its nature, there's been a tendency just to treat it as one thing because it's too complicated and difficult for us to operationalize research that accounts for the complexity and the differences. So I understand the methodological reasons why there has been a tendency to treat it as one thing, but I also think, as you've just highlighted, that it undermines the explanatory potential of the concept. And in some ways, it actually creates incongruences where, one scholar finds in their research that social capital produces or results in innovation, whereas someone else conducts the same methodology and they find that actually, no, there's no impact here on innovation. And that is, of course, because the potential for the kinds of actions that produce or contribute towards innovation, they're different potentials. Like there can be norms that facilitate information sharing, but the norms may not facilitate social introductions. And so, I think it is really important, and maybe we need to have a look at the result of the poll, because I was a little bit unsure about putting this forward because it doesn't seem to be reflected in the literature very strongly. But I'll just end the poll and share the results, because just about everybody agrees with it, with that point.
I thought it was interesting because, I did part of my dissertation, which involved social capital, but I had lived the life of social capital long before, I did that dissertation. So, it was very practical to me that it's more than one thing, but also cognitively, it affects how I think about social capital. I don't think about social capital as one thing. I think about social capital as a very broad construct that can be used in a multiplicity of ways, depending on who you are. But as a researcher putting on that hat, you have to remember that your results are sample specific. So if you don't find support for one thing over here and someone does a study, that doesn't negate necessarily the results. And you have to remember what is unique or different about these particular samples. So when we start talking about credible research, it is complex, it is hard, because you got to really put on your critical thinking hat.
Yeah, I completely agree. And my point that I made is that it is possible to conduct quality research in social capital, because a lot of people have. But because of the lack of frameworks and agreement and models and all of these kinds of things, it's challenging. It's difficult to do, I think. And so therefore, a lot of people, unfortunately, haven't been successful in developing quality research in social capital. And that is precisely what I hope we may be able to do, is to assist people to design quality research because of the complexities that you described. And perhaps these sort of pillars is starting to do that. Like, I think it's very clear to me that these pillars leave an enormous space for what social capital is, because it doesn't define it. It says, look, here's some qualities of it. It's a potential. This is what it does relative to what it is. It's multidimensional, but there's still enormous scope in the middle for people to be able to focus on different meaning, different explanations of human action, different applications, different processes. That still is all enabled. And perhaps over time we want to scale it back further, perhaps to provide more direction for people to be able to design their research. But right now, there's still an enormous amount of flexibility built into these pillars.
I'll say one last thing. In my dissertation, I had 3 constructs: social capital, servant leadership, and organizational citizenship behavior. Servant leadership and organizational citizenship behavior can be tracked back to the original scholars in both of those variables. However, they were clearly defined in the beginning, and as time has progressed, they have flumed into multiple definitions where there's no agreement now on what they actually mean. So what does that mean for social capital? So does social capital come from this construct where there are multiple definitions and nobody agrees to something that someone does agree on, and will it stick? Or will we come up with something everybody agrees on and then it will plume back out? What is the natural flow of that? I think that will be interesting to find out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you just said. I think that there's always trade-offs between defining things narrowly because it can limit the scope of inquiry and the potential for flexibility and creativity in developing explanations. But of course, the flip side of that is the lack of structure can provide the chaos, if you like, of what we see in the literature at the moment. So I might just quickly run through the results of the poll, just so we can see. The first one being social capital is a potential. It is not what it does. We had 73% of people strongly agreeing with that, but a few people also somewhat agreeing and one person somewhat disagreeing. For anyone who doesn't strongly agree, if you only somewhat agree or you're unsure or you disagree, we would love to hear from you. We would love to hear the reasons why. We'd love to try and incorporate those ideas into these pillars. You know, this is something that we've worked on even with a relatively small number of people. Obviously, our own discipline-specific, our backgrounds have shaped the way that we see social capital. No matter how hard we try to see other people's perspectives and be completely inclusive, you can't completely do that. So we'd love to hear from people who have any kind of differing views that may help to refine these pillars. The second one being outcomes, social actions. We had a little bit more of a mix. Only 27% of people said strongly agree. We had 55% say somewhat agree, and there was one person who was unsure and one person who somewhat disagreed. Social capital is dynamic. We had 82% saying strongly agree, and everyone else said somewhat agree. Activation is contextual. We had 82% say strongly agree, one person somewhat agree, and one person somewhat disagree. Social capital is multidimensional. 80% for strongly agree, 20% for somewhat agree. Produce positive and negative outcomes. 90% strongly agree, 10% somewhat agree. Social capital is located in the mental constructs of individuals. 50% strongly agree, 40% somewhat agree, and one person somewhat disagree. Has individual and collective properties. 90% agree, strongly agree, and 10% somewhat agree. Social capital is not universal. We had a real mix here. We had answers to all of them. We had 70% somewhat agreeing or strongly agreeing, but we had a real mix. And the social capital is not one thing that does one thing. We've got 60% strongly agreeing, 30% somewhat agreeing, and one person was unsure on that one. So certainly interesting results. All right, shall we move on to the next question? Lyndon in the chat posed the question of where social capital resides. So does my social capital reside in the mental constructs of others or in my own predispositions? And it's a great question, and one that I hadn't thought very deeply of until Lyndon actually brought that up fairly recently. And Lyndon, if you could speak to this as well. It goes back to Jim Coleman, actually, I believe, pointed out that how my social capital, if you like, if I can say my social capital, resides in how others think and feel about me. So it's whether they think I'm trustworthy, whether they think that I'm a good person. Yeah, what do you think?
I agree with what you just said. I mean, I think, how what you just said was how other people view me as trustworthy or worthy of support, or a number of different attitudes will eventually influence what kind of preferential opportunities I may have as a result of my social capital. And in contrast, how I perceive others will largely influence my treatment, my social actions directed toward them. At least that's how I view it. And a long time ago, in an exchange with James Coleman, that was his kind of inference from what we were talking about.
Yeah, and I think we can see that quite clearly. You know, think as an individual, if I wanted to build my social capital, then I can go out and meet people. I can, give to others and develop goodwill. I can establish a reputation for being trustworthy, and so forth. And all of these things mean that my actions are changing the way other people's view me, think about me, feel about me, understand me. And so I think that it really is quite clear that that's what it is, that my social capital, if you like, if I can own it, because it resides in other people's predispositions towards me, or their understandings or their mental constructs towards me. I think that's really quite interesting. Think about it in that way. Do we have any other questions? Stephen, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question, or I could ask it on your behalf.
Thanks, Tristan. Just again, appreciate the great presentation today. I was just curious if you see this project maybe going in the direction of a future vote and adoption by ISCA membership, similar to how other associations have principles of practice. For example, the Community Development Society has sort of officially adopted a set of principles of practice that are occasionally updated. So it's just curious what you see as the future of this project.
I think that's a long way off. I think that if we could get widespread agreement on it, then I'd say yes, that is something we could definitely look at doing. But the last thing I would want to do is to exclude people because they didn't agree with whatever the guidelines, principles were that we put forward. So I think unfortunately, this will take a while. I think we need to continue to refine and develop these, seek widespread input, see if we can get widespread agreement, see how these will actually impact individual practice. As I was developing this presentation, I would consistently come up with critiques of individual scholars or of entire approaches to social capital, and I would say, nope, hang on, this is not what I want to achieve here, and I would delete it. I'll delete the critique because I want to be inclusive of everybody as much as we possibly can, bring everyone in. But we do need to balance the need for critique and to be critical of the approaches that perhaps aren't logical and that aren't consistent and that are incongruent. Like we need to be critical of those approaches, but at the same time, we need to encourage people to develop more rigorous research. And as it stands right now, I think somewhere between a third and maybe as much as 2/3 of the literature on social capital may find themselves teetering on the edge of these pillars as I've currently outlined them, that they may want to examine their underlying assumptions and logics just to see whether or not they're consistent. And some people may conclude that they're not consistent and they don't want them to be. And others may conclude that, yes, in fact, I need to have some modifications here to my research design to improve the logical consistency and so forth that I've kind of outlined in this presentation. So I think short answer is we need people to have input on this. Yeah. I mean, what do you think, Stephen, about how we can progress? And I'm interested in people's ideas about how we can take this forward, because I've done an enormous amount of work to get it to where it is, and Lyndon as well. And so now we're kind of going, okay, so what now? How can we take this forward?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I was just thinking, scholarly discussions that are really transdisciplinary of sorts. I guess that was another question I had, was if there are maybe certain terms within the pillars that might be interpreted differently based on disciplinary definitions or meanings. But the initial reaction is that it appears that really the pillars do not have a lot of disciplinary based language. It does look like there's an attempt to, again, try to harmonize or to find a common ground across disciplinary boundaries. But yeah, next steps definitely, I understand, are having a lot of conversations, a lot of critique, and being widely inclusive.
Yeah, I think so. I had wondered whether it was possible for us to quite literally write these pillars with a version for sociologists and a version for economists and a version for, like, to actually use different language to describe the same thing, because the conversations that Lyndon and I have had, quite often the framing and the terminology will be so incredibly different to start, but we'll end up in the same place. And so I guess the concern is that someone may read even the language we've used here, that where we've tried to be as inclusive as possible, it still may not resonate with certain people. They may be like, well, you've called it, you've said that it's mental constructs, but I'm not familiar, I don't like that term. And so that may be a barrier for people engaging with that particular pillar, although they may actually agree with it when they dig into the meaning of what we mean by mental constructs. They might then agree, but on face value, they may not. So I think these are the kinds of challenges that we have to address. I've attempted this myself and utterly failed, because I'm not an economist, so I can't put it into economic language in a way where I'd be confident that it is communicating the meaning clearly. And I'm also not an anthropologist and all of the other disciplines that have approached social capital. So this isn't something I think one person can do. Certainly I can't, but perhaps others could. But this is the kind of input that I think, and discussions that are really interesting to have, because it'll help to reach that broad consensus about these pillars. Beverly, do you have something to add about that?
But I would disagree with you, Tristan. I think that you and Lyndon have come up with the right answer, because after you discussed it and you you found out you were just saying the same thing, but saying it differently, those words that you used when you came to that conclusion, that was the answer, because it was the plain language answer. And I think you've heard me say that when I go through the research, design, and methods courses. Yes, I'm talking about all this technical stuff, but my philosophy is always to try to explain it in plain language. So, and not to be condescending, but I'm trying to explain it so that everybody understands it at the same level. It's like me having a conversation with a 6-year-old, but not really, but using language such that my language is universal. So regardless of who's up on the forum, when I say, just tell me what you want to know, everyone can understand that, versus, well, let's get into the, technical aspects of developing this. I just put it in plain language. So when you say something like social capital has potential and it's not what it does, well, what do you mean? Well, social capital is something that can be used to develop something else because it has potential. Well, write it in plain language. Sometimes we use, I think it was, as Stephen said, some of these words that are not always clear and have multiple meanings. Just say what you mean what you say, be very clear. And in a forum like this, and what we're trying to do, I'm an advocate for just plain language, because English, if we're going to do this in English is a very complex language. So we use the same word that means so many different things. So just use plain language, and I think you'll nail it, and you can do it.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with what you're saying. And certainly I agree with your point about the English language having multiple meanings, because I regularly find I use a word and then somebody else will misunderstand what I've said because they understand that word to mean something a little bit different than what I had intended. And so there is that challenge in doing this, is that even the words we use can be understood differently from different perspectives.
But when we come down to foundational and plain language, whether you're speaking to an economist, psychologist, an anthropologist, or any of those folks, we all understand plain language. When we hear you say it in plain language, now we can suss it back up to our, highfalutin meanings. I can translate that into my economic language. But what I can't do is, if you're speaking to me using the psychological stuff and I am an economist, we can't communicate. But we can communicate if we're at that foundational level in plain language, because then I can translate it in my brain, but I can't go the other way.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. I think perhaps part of the challenge is that people who get into a disciplinary mindset, they understand the world in very specific ways. For an engineer, everything is about load and balance and so forth. That's how they understand the world. And for an economist, they understand the world as perhaps responding to needs and exchange of goods. And, there's very certain ways of framing these issues depending on the discipline you come from. And so someone coming from a particular discipline who doesn't see that framing in the pillars may not immediately maybe not, I'm sure they'd understand them, but they may not immediately appreciate how it works for their way of seeing the world. And that perhaps is the biggest reason to see if we can explain these from different perspectives of framing. And all of this sounds incredibly simple. Hey, there's one version of economics and there's one version of sociology, and all you need to do is come up with one set of language that works for any one of these disciplines. But of course, as we know, that's not the case. There's many different economics, there's many different sociologies, there's many different ways of thinking about the world, and therefore it's not that simple. So I think
it's not necessarily simple or hard, and I just speak from my schizophrenic past, I should say, of having literally a group of engineers who work two different systems, having planners and schedulers who don't speak engineer speak, they speak different speak, orbital analysts who speak different speak, and I'm the boss. I have to speak to all these people and they have to understand me very clearly. So in order to have all these people in the same meeting and understand me, I've got to come down to a language that everybody can understand. And that's all I'm saying here. It takes the context out of it. When we get understanding, we can roll the context back in. And that may just another way to think.
Yeah, I agree. And just to build on that a little more, I'm aware that, Lyndon probably agrees with just about all of this, but it is written from my framing. It is written from a sociological constructivist kind of approach to describe these pillars. And if Lyndon were to write these pillars, I'm absolutely certain they would be different than the ones that I've put forward, or at least explained in a different way. And my background, having read a lot of Habermas, for example, thinking about the world in terms of life world, as much as I've tried to suspend that as much as I can and to appreciate everybody's perspective on this, I also acknowledge that that's not completely possible. And that's one of the reasons why I'm absolutely certain that these pillars need to be reiterated considerably so that we can reach a broad consensus. And I think that's the next task, basically, for us to do that. Any other questions? Lyndon, I saw you had a point about predispositions and whether they're dynamic. Did you want to bring that up?
What I would like is for you to discuss a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about predispositions.
Yeah, sure. So I think predispositions reflect all of the values, attitudes, beliefs, emotions, understandings that we have, that we've built up throughout the course of our life about how we should or shouldn't act in given situations. So it covers an incredibly wide range of things. To me, I would much prefer to use the term life world or habitus even than predispositions, because it speaks to exactly what I mean. But of course, those terms are grounded in very particular theories and associated with very particular philosophical traditions. So we use the term predispositions, but it means much the same thing. So what it means is that every individual is predisposed, as in advance of any given situation, they're predisposed to act in certain kinds of ways. If I see someone struggling with a door, I'm predisposed to hold it open for them. If someone asks me for directions, I'm predisposed to give them directions. But those predispositions are quite specific, and we may hold predispositions towards people of different genders differently. So we can't be quite so generic and say I'd hold the door open for anyone. Well, maybe I would or wouldn't hold it open for a man relative to a woman. And that may also be different for different religions, different ethnicities, different, I don't know, a whole range of different criteria that may be different. I might hold different predispositions towards social action. So it is all of those things that exist in advance of any particular action. It's reflective of my norm, of the norms, or my understanding of the norms. It's reflective of my understanding of trust and trustworthiness of different individuals. It's reflective of my understanding of social sanctions that may occur if I did or didn't do something. It's reflective of the empathy that I feel towards others. Sense of identity or belonging, like all of those things are all encapsulated in this very broad idea of a predisposition.
Could I ask a follow-on question, Tristan, to that? I have a predisposition when I mow the lawn to go in a certain direction and how I do the corners and those kind of things. Would you be willing to perhaps qualify all of our predispositions and focus on those that really are related to social capital?
Yes. What I missed out in that explanation was my predispositions for social action. That is my predispositions for action that is oriented towards others. And okay. So the way in which I mow my lawn wouldn't be relevant to social capital unless the way I mow my lawn is action that is oriented towards others. And this is one of the areas where I think it requires a little more work, because I put up that slide that outlined the different modes of social action. And certainly cooperation and collective action at the top, absolutely, that is action that is my predispositions are relevant to social capital. But at the bottom, we had actions that are simply influenced by others. And I think that's a big gray area, whether or not they're outcomes that are related to, or outcomes that are, sorry, they are actions that are outcomes of social capital. Because I may mow the lawn with square corners because my wife thinks that I should, and I would be judged if I didn't. And so my actions are oriented towards others. But are we really going to call the way I do the corners of my lawn when I mow an outcome of social capital? I'm less confident there's any value in that. So I think this is one of those areas where it requires a little bit more thought and examination of what social actions. Social actions, I think, is too broad. I think it needs to be narrowed from that. But how we narrow it exactly, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
And to just one more point about that, like if we did say that social capital is a potential for social actions, then arguably we're talking about every single thing that every single human does all of the time. It's that broad, because our actions, when are our actions not influenced by, or somehow related to, or somehow oriented towards others? I mean, occasionally a mosquito on my neck and I slap my neck, that's perhaps not a social action, but virtually everything else that we do in life is somehow influenced by or oriented towards others. So clearly we need to narrow the scope here, because it's just far too broad to be useful.
Could you start us on that path and sort of narrow the class of social actions?
Well, I kind of tried, if I just get back to that slide, this is the slide. This is kind of my effort to try to narrow the scope here by saying, well, there's different modes of acting. The top probably two are absolutely outcomes of social capital. The third probably is as well, but it's less clear. And the bottom one, I think, is very much up for discussion. There is plenty of research that would treat those types of actions as outcomes of social capital, particularly the literature on public health. I'm less convinced. I'm not saying either way that for sure what we should do, but I'm less convinced that they are actually outcomes of social capital, because it becomes too broad. It becomes anything that's influenced by social setting, and that is everything. Like, humans are influenced by what other people think and feel. So for me, it's a little bit too hard basket. Hey, here's a slide. maybe some other scholars can have a crack at it and maybe be able to take this forward. Well, we're a little over time. I will take one final question or comment if anybody has anything. Otherwise, I think it's very nearly time to end the session.
Are you going to post the slides?
Yes. I shared a link just before to the slides people can download, and I'll send out in the follow-up email, I'll send out the link as well. I just posted it again in the chat if anyone wants to download the slides. All right, looks like we've come to the end. Thanks everyone for contributing. It's been a fascinating session and a great discussion, and I think we need to organize another way for us to continue this discussion. And so look out for that in the coming months. We'll find a way to continue this.
Thank you, Tristan.
Excellent, Tristan. Excellent.
Thanks, Beverly. Thanks, Lynn. And thanks everyone for taking part. Look forward to seeing you again in future.